Hey everybody, if you found this video useful or interesting in any way, please give me a like and subscribe. That would help out a lot for the growth of this channel, and it'll let me know that I'm doing something that you enjoy. All right? See ya. Okay, today we're going to talk about my specialty, which is physical preparation for teams. And there's something that athletes get wrong all the time with this. They see something kind of flashy on the internet for training, and somebody has some explanation of what they're doing with an athlete, and it oftentimes gets overblown and kind of recycled into that sport. So what I mean by that is, for instance, in the world of basketball, I spent 2.5 years working with men's and women's basketball at the Division I level, and there would often be times where either coaches or players would want to do certain exercises, or they would see something online. I saw a lot of colleagues doing things online. They'd be recording workouts that they found from some person who has like a big name in the field, or they just work with big time athletes. And this was super prevalent with like NBA talent in the off season. And they would film a workout, and our basketball guys would think like, okay, that's what I need to be doing because they are at that level. So there's like this belief that if somebody's at that level, they got there by deciding to do these things. And the reality is that this is a very small snapshot of that athlete's life cycle in their sport. So, this person became really good at their sport because they were really good at understanding the X's and O's of their sport. And then they also had the athleticism and size that other people didn't have. So there's so many factors that kind of go into that. But a lot of the times, unfortunately, there are athletes and coaches that get a large following because, in the sense of like their training, their off-season training, because of exposure rather than it being something really high quality. And oftentimes we'll see teams really undertraining individual athletes because either athletes get bored of doing the big block stuff that actually makes changes and really dictates a lot of their training regimen and their health overall for like long periods of time. For instance, if you're training hard all the time, it's hard on your body. But it's also, ironically, the thing that's going to prepare you the most for your sport other than your sport itself. If you're doing something really, really low intensity, if you're doing a lot of isometrics, for instance, under very low load for the majority of your off season, you aren't really going to be prepared for the demands when you actually get back into your sport, and you're going to be at a lot higher likelihood of having injuries occur. And this stuff happens all the time. I would see athletes at the college level, and they wouldn't do things in the off season, and they'd be fine for like the first 2-3 weeks or something of the season, and then they'd just hit a wall and just never get past that. So the messaging has to be, one, for athletes, if you get bored with the training, it's understandable, and that's where a good coach is going to help you adjust, and they are going to be paying attention to that stuff, but they aren't going to take their foot off the pedal entirely either. And if you're working with somebody who says, well, you've had a lot of this tough stuff, so we're going to take 3 months of doing nothing or whatever, it's like, okay, so is that basketball athlete, for instance, not practicing anymore? Like, are they not going to do a pickup game with friends or people that are at a similar level of competition in the off season, which I found would happen all the time? So they're still getting a high level of intensity there, but then the training itself, the physical training, as far as like the strength training, the agility, the speed work, the conditioning, all of that stuff gets drawn so far back that they don't have any foundation for when the season actually gets going. And like I said, unfortunately, this is way more common, and athletes are not prepared. There's certainly a time and place to bring it all back down, and touch on some things and get some movement quality going, and focus on some of those things that may need to be touched on, in the sense of, really reducing load, training load. But you have to be in control of a lot of those variables and not just, the weight room stuff. And then, the athlete goes on and does 2-3 hours of on the court stuff. So again, like, it's something that I saw all the time. So for instance, what I would do when I was working with my teams, and we had a very low injury rate overall. We did have some injuries happen, of course. Some of that stuff is uncontrollable. Some of it happens by nature of previous injury history. But all in all, the majority of the injuries that we sustained with the teams that I worked with were a couple days or a week, maybe 2 at a time, and then right back to it and able to jump back in. And the way that I felt like I was able to make my athletes the most robust and being able to be resilient to the demands of their sport was create a very large base in the off season. That meant a lot more volume of work in the off season, and then tapering that off. I think the concept of having tapers, so to speak, from like a track and field perspective is fantastic, because I think it works. And so we would do a lot of the conditioning, general conditioning to specific conditioning to general training, more bodybuilding type work in the off season to more specific type of strength work as we kind of ramp things up and we got together as a team, and we were building foundational movements in the off season, all that good stuff. And that prepared us a lot of the time to have minimal time of injuries occurring. Because, when you're on the court, you step on a guy's foot, you roll an ankle, you never know how long that's going to take. It could be 2 weeks. It could be 3-4 days. In the majority of the time, from my experience, it was a shorter end period. And this was something that our athletic trainer even commented on, from the men's side. He was like, we're really lucky to have you because we have very few injuries. You make my job kind of boring, which is nice. And I thought that was fantastic. When we have athletes that had an injury history relating to like an ACL tear, like if they had an ACL tear on one knee, they have an increased risk of tearing the other ACL, and they have a greater risk of tearing that same ACL. And that stuff did happen during the preseason and into the early part of the year most of the time. That's kind of where a lot of those injuries tend to happen. And then you get some overuse injuries that happen on the back end of the season a lot of time, a lot of bumps and bruises, that kind of stuff. So you have to prepare and then kind of be very strategic as the season goes with having a high enough intensity. So it doesn't have to be max effort all the time, but it has to be high enough intensity to actually create a stimulus, and then relatively low volume because we're just looking for that stimulus. We're looking to kind of maintain some of that stuff. If we can kind of carry on our strength throughout the season, that's what we're looking to do as well. And then we're, again, just kind of tapering off as we need. And that's where having a coach who understands principles of training and understands some of that physiology can really come in handy, because they are going to be able to monitor those things very strategically versus kind of having a random, we're at, week 16, it's time to do 8 sets of 16 now all of a sudden. And it's like, what, why, why do that all of a sudden? And I've seen stuff like that. Unfortunately, it happens. But as an athlete, as somebody who's looking to strategically give yourself the best advantage, you need to work with people who don't just come with a recommendation from your peers. That's important. I do think that's important, because even just speaking the language and understanding people is important. But you have to look at the track record too. And I think that is a great point to make. If you are working with somebody who has worked with teams and they've had generally low injury rates throughout careers, that is huge, because a strength and conditioning coach is not going to prevent injuries, so to speak, but they are absolutely going to influence the rate of having some of those kinds of like smaller injuries occur from normal wear and tear throughout a season. And then also they're going to help with the preparation coming back from injuries as well. If they're smart, if they have a background in some of that stuff. Unfortunately, in the world of performance, there is a huge gap from the time an athlete gets injured and starts to do their initial rehab to actually being ready to return to sport. And that's what it is. It's return to sport. You're amping up everything. And unfortunately, in my experience, a lot of the time from what I saw was, and it's just the nature of different professions having different expertise, but you have a physician who has a timeline. They set a timeline. They say, you have X number of weeks before you can return to this level of movement quality, just based on physiology. That's kind of what we found. And then you have an athletic trainer who's kind of taking them through the steps to get to that point. And then it's like expectation to get back on the court or back on the field. And it's like, well, that's not how that works. You can't be, let's say for an ACL, 10 to 12 months, you can't be at 8 months of doing rehab. And then at month 9, they're like, yeah, this whole month you're just getting ready, so to speak, to get back in the game, when you haven't really had a period of like a gradual increase. And it's been more like, okay, we've stepped up and now we're going to shoot up. So that's where you really, really run into some of those risk factors. And that's where understanding physiology, understanding anatomy, understanding training principles, all of that stuff, movement quality, force outputs. There's so many different things that are going to kind of come into play and can really make or break how good you are as a coach. And athletes need to be aware of some of those coaches and what they actually stand for and what they understand.